Kyron sat on his bed as he pondered on the offer he was given. Sure, it sounded nice, but could he really do it? Was he capable of what they were asking of him? He did get straight A's in high school, but this was nearly 10 years ago. He had been offered scholarships. And what did I do? He thought. I threw it all away by being a damn idiot, hanging out with Kyle and Jeremiah. I never should have. I can't go there, though. What's done is done. I've worked this hard to get clean and finally get a place of my own. The opportunity is in the palm of my hands now. I just have to grasp it. I have the smarts for it, and I built myself up on the streets. I got this. I can do this, he thought. Or at least, he hoped. He glanced around the studio apartment he had finally gotten after hard work at the local mass grocery store, pushing carts back in after the customers left them in their cart returns. That was on a good day, though. Most of the time, the lazy good-for-nothings left them strewn all over the huge parking lot. And sometimes it would hit other cars once the gravel that had been holding it in place shifted. The cart would sail downhill, picking up an alarming speed and straight into a car. A white one, typically. It seemed like it was always a white car. Perhaps the drivers of the white cars liked to walk when going to the store, instead of parking closer to the doors, but who knows? Maybe it was strong irony. Rolling his eyes, he looked to the pictures he had hung on the walls of his friends and family. Then his eyes moved to the girl he had started seeing. Wasn't she such a beauty? Her and her dark brown eyes and hair that matched, sparking a light in the darkness of her beauty. She liked to play video games, which seemed unheard of in this area, or anywhere else for that matter, he thought. He found a keeper, it seemed. His life had finally gotten in order, and he had that strange phenomenon called consistency. Not even a year ago, he would have never believed he could have come this far and in such a short amount of time. And if he took this offer, he would be able to do even more without the wait time and working overtime at the local grocery store. Even though he had just gotten with his girlfriend 2 months ago, he decided to play gentleman and ask her first to see what she would say. Pulling out his phone, he gave her a call as he laid back and stared at the barren ceiling with its strangely yet common print of what appeared to have been sponge-painted patterns, while some remained unorganized blobs that dried before they had dripped down further. "Hello?" Phoebe answered. "Hey, babe," Kyron smiled. "How's it going?" He shifted on his pillow as he looked at the wall where he had a single poster taped to it, since the landlord did not allow them to make any holes with pushpins or hooks, that consisted of the most recent favorite video game featuring a silver-black dragon spraying fire on a village of unsuspecting pheasants. The man wielding the sword and shield was standing with both raised as he appeared to be roaring at the dragon. "Good, it's good to hear from you. How'd it go?" "Well, that's actually what I wanted to talk to you about." "Okay." She knows, he thought. They made me a pretty amazing offer, and I think I'm going to take it. What was their offer? What is it exactly? They only asked you to come in for an interview at the biology place that you didn't even apply for. Right. Well, they're going to give me $1 million to... What? Phoebe gasped. She began spewing words of giddiness, filling the receiving end of the phone with portions of static from her high-pitched squeals of joy. But, he said loud and firm. This settled her at once. The job they offered me is going to be extremely difficult, to say the least. What is it? She asked, still breathless. Well, they want me to track into one continent to the other. No! Are you kidding? No, I forbid it. You'll die out there. No one has ever... I'm not in the least bit. But look at the opportunity that this gives us. I mean, 1 million. Think of it, he said in a near dreamy voice. But it's so dangerous. Everyone who has went to the Continental connected lands never came back or passed through to the other side. They just disappear. I realize that, but if I can pull this off, I will, 1, have $1 million, and 2, may have the opportunities at the Biology Center afterwards. It was one of the childhood dreams that I've always wanted to do. This was no lie either. His mother encouraged him to play outside, discovering new living things and inspecting them to not only learn more about them, but their anatomy and everything in between. So far, even as a child, he had not once changed his mind on what he wanted to do and his career to be. And here he was with one hell of an opportunity. What are they going to do to protect you? What are they giving you? I don't know the fine details, but I want to go ahead and accept it. There was a silence over the phone that he had thought she had disconnected. Then finally, she spoke softly. Are you sure about this? Sure as hell I am, he smiled. Several weeks later. Mr. Holloway. A gray-haired gentleman smiled as he descended the polished steps of the Continental Biology Global Center. I'm pleased to see that you accepted my invitation and have been trained sufficiently in using the equipment that we will be providing for you for your expedition. How are you feeling? He asked as he patted Chiron on the shoulder. He was a rather short and slightly plump man who sported a black suit and tie, as any manager of this type of facility seemed to prefer, but it was apparent that he had not lived a tough life. I'm not sure yet, Chiron chuckled. A little nervous, to say the least. Nervous! The man jeered as he leaned back and raised his eyebrows at Chiron, patting him again on the shoulder before relaxing back into his normal stature. Don't be nervous, young man. Your score on the tests were phenomenal. Your knowledge on plant types and properties was astounding, not to mention your athletic skills were far beyond what I was anticipating. Chiron thought back to his days on the streets, jumping over fences, weaseling his way out of small windows effortlessly, and running for extended periods of time without delay. Everything happens for a reason, I guess, he thought to himself. Thank you, I appreciate that. Chiron smiled as he glanced down at his shoes. Do you have any questions before I head into my next meeting? The man asked. I don't believe so. We will see you before dawn tomorrow, son. The man said one final pat on Chiron's shoulder before turning and heading towards the open doors of the Biology Center. Chiron glanced in and noticed that every seat he could see was occupied, and wondered what type of seminar was about to begin. As he turned and left the building, he glanced down at the booklet they had given him of all the items that they would like him to try and cover, capture, or record as much information on as possible. Flipping through the pages, it seemed like there were nearly 200 requests, and some of them were highlighted in red and yellow. He came across one highlighted in black, but the lettering was white. He continued flipping and did not come across another one like that, deciding to return to it and see what it said. Latinum umbra? He whispered to himself. Off to the side of it in smaller text, he read, AKA Lurking Shadow. He stared at it for a moment before laughing as they had colored it in dark color like its name. So far, he had not sensed much humor in these folks, but perhaps they might have an inkling. There was more below it regarding the shadow, but decided to read more on it once he got home. Perhaps he would have himself one last drink before he ventured out for likely the next several months or so in the wilderness. Since this was a dangerous trip, it would be unwise to take the stupid juice with him. He chuckled to himself as he made his way back home. As he set his drink down on his nightstand, he twirled and plopped down into his thick comforter, laying perfectly on his bed as the papers jostled about, almost appearing offended by his sudden lack of care of their order. He leaned over and turned on his lamp as he took the ice-cold gin on rocks and a rather large swig before lighting himself a cigarette. The bitter cold drink turned into liquid fire as it made its way down his throat and smacked his lips once with an audible sigh. Staring up at the ceiling, he watched the fan blades rotating and watched the smoke floating, getting caught in the breeze, blowing in an eerily beautiful cloud swirling around the room. Peering down at his papers, he set his glass back down and took the booklet in hand as he leaned against his pillows and looked over the first page. It seemed simple enough. Basic knowledge and common sense were all on the front pages, bore in its instructions. Flipping through the first few pages, he saw that this was also the same. Taking another large swig of gin, he figured he may venture into the creatures and plants section of what they desired to have more information on, eventually once getting past what he considered were the terms and conditions. "I'm an explorer now," he thought with a smirk. He was not as much interested in the plants, though he was sure that they were likely to make a groundbreaking discovery of something that contained properties to cure illnesses like never before. Perhaps even cancer, he thought. What a time to be alive and have such an opportunity to have to be the one to bring it about. He would make the headlines, the news would be all over to speak to him personally, carelessly pushing others aside to get a word from him. He imagined himself sitting in a comfy chair, bloated with stuffing, as he would interlock his hands and prepare to be asked the questions that everyone nationally was dying to know. He could imagine all the families sitting at home watching with focus and unrelenting desire to hear firsthand what the world was like. He flipped through artists' designs of plants that some had seen close to the Continental connected lands, but dared not to venture close enough to take them in hand. One of them, from what he could tell from the sketch, was like a rose bush with thorns and flowers on them, but they were odd. The flowers themselves were similar to a rose, but they bore sharp edges along the petals and something sticking out of the center that appeared to be a glob or a blob-type shape with a small question mark above it. The leaves were like those on a fern, extending perhaps 3 inches or so from the stems themselves, while the stems were covered in different-sized thorns. What an unusual-looking plant, he thought. He would look more closely at the plants before bed. He was more interested in the creatures that were rumored sightings, some of which had been claimed for centuries and the descriptions matched, but seemed as though they were only myths to keep kids and teens from venturing into the woods of the Continental Divide. There was simply not enough evidence to support their existence. He turned to page 52, since it appeared all items had their own page and all information they had thus gathered so far. Arriving at the page that stated, "Unknown Creatures," and below it in much smaller print it said, "Creatures are labeled from what is believed to not be aggressive to most aggressive. Those highlighted in green pose little to no threat. Those highlighted as yellow pose some threat if provoked. Those highlighted in red are aggressive and dangerous. Caution is advised for creatures in red. Those highlighted in black are considered extremely violent and lethal. Black is likely to hunt and difficult to take down if force is required." Remembering that he had seen only one in black, he flipped nearly to the end of the book until coming across it again. Latinum umbra. This creature is claimed to have been seen centuries ago, but there have been no such sightings within the past 200 years. This could possibly be a myth, but as this is uncharted land, it is desired to confirm if the subject is fictional or reality. He murmured. There was an artist's sketch of it, but it was poor, just as he had seen earlier on his way home. Little was provided and seemed as though someone had just taken their pen and scratched the paper enough to form a black shape with 2 glowing eyes and an unrealistic-sized mouthful of what appeared to be teeth from an eel. Very thin and sharp, but appearing see-through, almost as if they were made of glass. The shape of the creature was difficult to tell, since nearly the whole thing was solid black, but it seemed like its head was exploding. Sketchy lines extended what appeared to be 4 or 5 inches from its body. He shook his head at the thought of such creature and assumed since there had been no recent sightings, this thing had to either be a myth or it was an abomination from hell that was luckily extinct. Then he wondered how in the world the things mated. He could even envision spiders, sharks, and even the nastiest of creatures he knew of mating, but nothing like this. His lip curled in disgust at the thought, then decided to laugh it off as he took another sip of his glass of gin. The ice danced around in a state of panic, clinking against the glass, desperate to be out of its freezing fiery ice that burned like a sun. Curiosity took him to the red section, as there was nothing else provided of this creature other than the last known sighting. It was of a woman who was admitted into a mental institution. She screamed all hours of the night and begged for staff to never turn her lights off. A new nurse came one night and turned the lights off after they had sedated her. The following morning, the woman was pronounced dead, and he assumed by the lights they meant that they blew out the candles, as light bulbs were not around then. But history was not his strong point either. Arriving at the section of red, he came across one that looked like a finch. Furrowing his brows, he looked for her size, and it was just as small in the detailed specifications of the animal to find it was exactly what he thought. Confused, he scanned over the information section. Palilla, also known as the scarlet finch. It is also known as the vampire finch or leech finch. Resembling a rose finch with their beautiful colors of red and black, this mimic appears harmless but is actually quite dangerous. Little is known of the Palilla, but each person who has been attacked by it typically dies within 12 hours or less due to blood poisoning. A result of the blood poisoning is accelerated septic shock. Thus far, typical antibiotics and blood transfusions, along with other common remedies, have no effect on the patient. This type of sepsis is called scarlet septic shock or SSS. Normally preying on other predators, such as felines and serpents who hunt birds and other small animals, the scarlet finch mimics eating seed or bugs from the ground without noticing the hunter. As the hunter jumps into action, the mimic has a jaw that can unhinge similar to a snake and sinks its retractable fangs into the victim, paralyzing its prey. Thus far, no human patient has experienced paralysis symptoms. Well, shit, he chuckled as he took another sip of gin. Demon finches, huh? So they are a thing? I wondered about that. What else they got here? He trailed off as he gazed down at the semi-glossy pages. He flipped rapidly until coming across something vividly white and as fluffy as a recently spun cotton candy. As he returned to the page, he saw what looked like a beautiful butterfly. Glancing to the name, he read, Tarantula vanvarkaru scoro, aka the cotton moth tarantula, as it mimics the Venezuelan poodle moth in appearance, but few sightings have been made, but has been known in slang as flying spiders, as this is the only arachnid that has flight-borne capabilities and wings. Well, I'll be damned, he thought. So flying spiders are actually a thing then. He recalled having such nightmares when he was a kid. Typically in his dreams, they were harvestmen, or whatever is called as the granddaddy longlegs, or granddaddies. The spiders would jump from trees when he was playing in his dream, but then would spread their legs and begin to soar much quicker than his little legs could carry him. These nightmares never ended on a good note, and normally would have woken his mom by his cries in the night. As he read on, his eyes grew wide. Only a handful of survivors who have seen them have stated that this mimic is the size of the average man's hand. They flutter about as a typical moth before swooping down at an alarming speed, while its 8 legs spread open, ready to puncture flesh. Its bite is fatal if not treated within 5 hours, but is easily cured with basic antibiotics. Slapping the book shut, he glanced at the time and realized how late it had grown. It was almost like he had been childishly reading over one of his comic books as he sat under the covers with a flashlight after his mother had already told him to go to bed. Time had simply passed way too fast. Downing the last of his drink, he set it back on his bedside table and turned the lights off as he lay awake considering what he may actually be getting himself into. Now that he had actually looked at the booklet, all of the things they desired of him to study and collect if possible. The following morning, as he drank his coffee, he listened to some of his favorite songs along the way as he tread quickly through traffic. When he arrived at the center, there was already an armored vehicle waiting for him with several men standing outside in formation. The sight gave him chills, thinking that they were already honoring his death, but he approached nonetheless. With him, he carried a small fanny pack for his personal items. This included his toothbrush, toothpaste, bar soap, rolling papers along with a pipe and tobacco, a leather-bound pocket notebook, and a pen. Along with this, he brought along his sobriety coin he had earned for 1 full year of being off the needle and snow. He could fairly hear it clinking on his pipe as he removed his headphones, approaching the men at the vehicle. From behind the van came a much younger man in a suit he had yet to meet. The man waved at Chiron as he returned it with a single wave and a smile. Something about it felt rather off to Chiron, though. "Good morning," Chiron said as he held his hand out. "Morning, Chiron." The man smiled as he took Chiron's hand and shook it vigorously. "Good to see you, old boy. I was hoping you wouldn't chicken out on me the day of the immaculate quest that you're taking on." Chiron glanced at his suit, but saw nothing on it that said his name. "What was your name again, sir?" he asked. "Ha ha ha ha!" He laughed deeply and slapped Chiron on the shoulder. "It's Byron Sluver, CEO of this fine corporation of discoveries and medicines." He turned and held his hand out towards the building, seeming to gaze on it with admiration. The rising sun sprayed color on the darkened windows and the silvery metallic sheen outside of the towering place. Chiron thought it was a rather impressive building, but nothing compared to what its purpose was. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Sluver." "The pleasure's all mine, Chiron. You can call me Byron. Our names sound a bit similar, do they not?" Byron chuckled. Yeah, they do. So, what do we do next? I have the booklet with me," he said as he held it up with one hand. "I only brought a fanny pack's worth of personal items, just as instructed." "Good job, my boy. I'll let Dr. Z Sharp take over from here," he said as he gestured to her and began heading back towards the building. "Good luck, son," Byron called over his shoulder. A small woman in a large lab coat approached him with her brows furrowed behind her thin-rimmed glasses and her thin lips pursed as she scrutinized at him a moment, before looking behind her back at Byron, then waved him off as she shook her head. "This is it, yes?" She looked Chiron up and down with another shake of her head. "Are you fit for this, boy?" she asked, placing her hands on her hips. "I'm confident that I can do the instructed task, yes," Chiron said, but he could feel his ears growing hot. "Have you even looked at the booklet?" she asked as she gestured to it, then eyed him in the same stance. "I have, actually. I am thrilled to have this opportunity to—" "No, you haven't! I don't even believe you peeked into that thing," she said as she threw her hand up and proceeded to land back down on her hip again. "You're aware of the dangers of this mission, no?" "I'm aware of what's at stake, and extreme caution must be used at all times, even for the labeled in green." "So you have either glanced at it or just a lucky guess, then?" "I did look at it," he defended as politely as possible. "What are you going to do if you're attacked?" "It depends on what's attacking me with how I would respond to it." "What do you do if you're being chased?" "That also depends on what's chasing me. I took all the necessary classes on how to utilize the equipment and the weapons provided, so I can protect and collect to the best of my ability." She narrowed her eyes on him again, before looking to the men standing next to the armored vehicle, then back to Chiron. "You are aware that you have a high likelihood of not returning, yes?" "I am aware that this mission is dangerous enough that I may not return, yes." She nodded twice as she glanced down to her shoes, then back to Chiron. "You're either brave or stupid, perhaps both. That I am not sure of. But you have been chosen, and I must trust my boss. Shall we?" She had gestured toward the van. Two of the men opened the doors promptly and stepped aside. Dr. Sharp climbed in and sat herself down in one of the seats as she buckled both of her belts crisscross. She looked to him and scowled. "What are you staring at, boy? Get in!" she hissed. Chiron climbed into the back with her and sat down on the seat across from her as the men shut the doors back. As he began buckling, he glanced to the side to see 2 other men sitting in other seats, heavily armed. He dared not raise his brows with Dr. Sharp watching him carefully, and went to buckling himself in. The van started and began moving when he looked up to Sharp. "So, boy, Chiron, is it?" "Yes, ma'am." "Save your formalities, Chiron. You can call me Z." "Okay, Z." "Good. Listen, have you actually gone through that booklet? It hurts you to lie to me. Does not hurt me." "I have gone through most of it, yes." "No good. You go through it all. What have you not looked at?" "Mainly the plants." She threw her hands up as she leaned her head back, gazing at the ceiling of the vehicle. Aye, Chiron. One of the more important things you should have looked at." "I assumed that knowing the creatures and their dangers would be the optimum to know first. This way I know how to react and defend myself from—" "No!" Z hissed. "Some of the plants can eat and poison you as well. Not wise, Chiron. Look while you have the time. This is an hour-long trip and gives you enough time to review them and ask me questions." "Okay," he murmured, feeling not only his ears but his cheeks growing red at this point. His confidence on the mission was drained from one small woman with a snarky attitude, though he knew that her intentions were good. Dropping his eyes down to the booklet, he opened it up and began reviewing the plants. Most were typical in appearance, but the majority were all in green, posing little to no threat. There was a small yellow section and an even smaller red section. It did not appear there were any in black, thankfully. He reviewed all of them one by one quickly, and then flipped back through them again to ensure he understood each one of them. As he looked up, he saw Z's eyes were on him, with her arms crossed as she spoke. "Questions?" "I don't believe so, actually." "Yes?" It seemed as though she perked up quite a bit, that he even had an inquiry. It's not about the plants, though. Is that your particular field?" "I do a little bit of everything, but plants are my main ordeal. What is it that you want to know, Chiron?" She gazed at him with her chin up and her eyes peering down from beneath her glasses. As she pursed her lips, he could see the years of lines from what appeared to be stress lines, or perhaps it was simply how often she gave that look. "I saw one in black," he began. He waited, but she said nothing. "What do you know about the lurking shadow?" Her head slowly tilted back to face him directly as she raised one brow. "You wish to know of the Lantinum Umbra?" The curiosity in her voice was thick, and it seemed she cared not that it showed. "Everything that we know is in that booklet." "Well, I'd hoped that there had been more, even if it was just educated guesses. Like, what is it exactly? What does it eat? Is it nocturnal?" "We know nearly nothing of this creature, though most assume it's a myth. Your chance of running into this one is likely 0.0001%. I cannot see you coming across such a thing. They have not even been seen since 200 years ago. Besides, though this is the only one in Category Black, do you have any concerns of Category Red creatures? There are many, and your likelihood of running into them is much higher than this mythical creature." "I assumed so. It's just, since we knew so little about it, I wondered if there was more that you may have known that wasn't considered facts, but I don't know, your professional opinion." "Here is my professional opinion, Chiron. I say, forget the thing. I say it is a myth to scare children from venturing off into the woods at night, to be stupid and immature. If it were an actual creature, then it would have been extinct by now, as no one has seen one in centuries. They would have emerged by now. Perhaps one delusional and becomes lost venturing out into the open, or some ignorant camper who set up camp much too close to the Continental bridges. There have been no such reports, or we would have heard of it. What you should worry about is Category Red creatures and plants. They are most threatening. Yellow, not so much unless you act stupid, or how does the younger generation call it in your video games? Unless you aggro them. They will typically not attack unless you are wounded, they are wounded, or you're near the nest. So, if most of the creatures are as harmless as the everyday hornet, then why has no one been sent in before?" "They have," she said blandly as her face lost all expression. They have? Yes, Kyron, they have. They do not return. We have all their last locations, but that's all. Kyron glanced down to the booklet he held in his hands as his palms became clammy and uncomfortable holding the papers. It felt as though he had been riding a roller coaster but felt nothing until the drop. Did they find the cause of death? No, bodies are not recovered. This is why you signed a waiver, Kyron. Your life belongs to us now, and so does your body, which will likely be disposed of in an eternal tomb if any of your body is left. Perhaps creatures that exist in the woods even eat your bones. We don't know. This is why we want to study them and better understand them. This is science and discovery. Everything comes at a cost and never without a price. Lack of sleep, missing your family, burnout, madness, sometimes death. But with all the great discoveries have come great prices, in some form or fashion, in exchange for the knowledge given, so that others may benefit from it. Just as your mother gave birth to you, it cost her greatly, not just on her body, but her mind and rest. Years of struggling and teaching, and tears you never saw that she cried. It all comes with a price, Kyron. Always. Kyron looked down to his feet and thought of the last conversation that he had had with his mother. How he had not only told her that he hated her, but that he prayed death upon her. However, death came in much quicker than he ever imagined it would for a woman to have a child at such an early age of 14. He stood at the woman's grave that brought his life into existence at the numbers on the headstone reading the occupant is 6 foot deep, had reached the age of 39. Not even a week after he spat his words of hate at her, she was hit by a drunk driver. Her lung was punctured by one of her ribs as the impact of the vehicles caved her ribs inward. The drunk driver died instantly as he went through the windshield and broke his neck. Kyron, Z said, now is not the time to visit memories, son. I don't want to hear it, she said as she waved her hand in a shooing motion. I don't like feelings, they interfere with logic, and this is our mission. Focus, boy. I have a female hormone that causes emotion, and I am handling mine well. But you aren't going out there, though, he said. I'm the one who did not stray from the right path. You are. I know who you are, Kyron. How do you... It doesn't matter, other than I had a hand in picking out our final contestants to do this mission, but there were no pictures. I pictured you much different, but all I know about you were not my first choice. Ow, he said as he furrowed his brows with a smirk, but could feel his cheeks growing red again. See, Kyron, emotions only get in the way. Now, do you have any questions about anything in the booklet? Otherwise, my ride here was useless. You rode with me for questions? Of course I did, you oaf. Well, he mumbled as he flipped through the booklet back again. This plant, known commonly as the corpus trapper, isn't that the same thing as the corpse flower? No! Did you not read on it? She hissed. Her passion had returned. Yeah, but it seems the same to me. The main difference of these two plants, she began as they continued their journey. The road became less smooth and more rutted with potholes covering half the road, then turned to gravel. After the gravel had ended, it had become a dirt path that seemed to continue on with the same trees passing them every mile, though it was a straight ride bearing no curves or turns. The trees became larger and denser, while the foliage itself became less familiar and more unusual. Some of the mosses had turned from green to what looked like a dying yellow, but then he had been seeing moss that was red. He'd seen some that appeared pink and black with strange things crawling all over them as if they were made of static. He noticed a small animal hop into a burrow and thought he recognized it from the booklet, and he went flipping through it. The rugged hare, he said. It was a category green creature, but it was certainly a strange rabbit indeed. It looked like most of its flesh had been torn to pieces, while skeleton and bone were exposed. He turned to Z, who was already looking at him. Was that a rugged hare? It sure enough was. Good eye, Kyron. Keep it that way and stay on high alert. As you well know, this is a category green mammal. Be patient. You will see red and yellow. Worry not your little head, she smiled. Are we going to be at our destination anytime soon? Within a few minutes, actually, she said as she glanced at her watch. But it was not actually a watch at all, but a GPS. She had been watching their location when not creepily staring at him, he thought. So why haven't we already stopped since there was already one of those creatures I need to study just back there? Because there's a specific area we must get you to before our departure. We don't want you dying before you get there, you know, she chuckled. Dying? Hush, it was just merely a joke, Kyron. Cheer up. But didn't you say earlier? Enough, okay? We are taking you to the facility where you will be staying for a short time before moving on to the next. There's facilities in these parts? Strangely enough, yes, there are. But how? That's classified information, dear Kyron, and I'm not permitted to speak of it. He stared at her a moment before dropping his eyes when the vehicle began to slow. He peered out the window again to see they were coming to a halt at a small opening in the trees. All the plants and foliage were dead around the little building that she had referred to as the facility. Nothing surrounded it in a perfect circle where everything seemed to die if it reached there. There were even skeletons of animals lying about in the sandy areas of the forest floor. What is this? This can only be touched by humans. We're unsure why, but everything else that tries to pass this boundary, she said as she pointed halfway around the circle, becomes paralyzed and its organs fail within minutes. That much we know. However, I could see the question in your eyes already. Why do we not bring back some of the bodies to study them, you're wondering? The flesh and all organic material that is not bone rapidly decays in an hour. We don't know why this happens either. Are you sure it's safe for humans? I mean, you said no one's traveled on this expedition and returned, right? Correct. But we know it's safe. This is also classified information, Kyron. Kyron began feeling like he was inside of a sci-fi movie. Unexplainable creatures, places, and things happening all around. Unknowns everywhere you look. Classified information. It seemed like it was the whole 9 yards. All that he was missing was seeing cat-red creatures. The chaotic beings that should not be. Being sent on a suicide mission. Then he began wondering if he were even coming back. He had gone this far, and he did not want to turn back now. Now to think of it, he likely did not even have that option. They would leave him here by force. They had already spent money on him, whether or not this was disposable, but it was now apparent that he too was disposable. Well, is there anything else that I need to know? Like the facility itself? Does it have any shelters or of any sort of protective gear that I can use? Kyron asked as he followed Z onto the dead circle, as her oversized lab coat fluttered behind her, and her knee-high black boots crunched in the sand. He realized that this sand was no ordinary sand. It was much too fine, as strange as the thought felt. Perhaps it was not its texture but its density. Something felt wrong about it, but he could not quite place what exactly it was. It was like when you were a child at your friend's house, and you heard them speaking in normal tone, but their words, that you did not quite know, but knew were aggressive, were being spoken. That unsettling feeling that sank within your stomach and deep down, giving you a sickness left behind that lingered, causing your fingers to tingle with warning. Instinct saying that something was not right. Is this how the others felt before me? He pondered. Yes, of course there is, so pick up the pace and listen carefully, as we will be far gone by sunset, Kyron. She said as she used her keys hidden within her coat pocket to begin unlocking the door to the facility. If nothing can survive this, then why is there a lock on the door? He asked. She stopped as the lock clicked, but did not pull the key from the hole as she seemed to stare into the metal itself. He could see a small portion of her hair quiver that lay on her back from the dark contrast against the white coat before she jerked the key out. She turned to him in an expression he could not read. "Why must you be so, Kyron?" she asked breathlessly. I thought the questions were your thing, the reason why you're here," he said as he followed her inside. The door was very heavy, and he had to actually put some strength into it to open it, which he found rather unusual. And why is this door so heavy to push open? It's like one of those in a factory that keep you from banging it against the wall or something. Again, she stopped as she said this, then turned and flipped the lights on. The entire place seemed to be made of metal except for seats that seemed to be made of metal and only a portion of it. Everything seemed like an unscratchable chrome coating or super durable. The door shut with a heavy bang behind them as he jumped and made a small noise as she turned to him with a look of disbelief. "If you are that jumpy, son, you're not going to make it past your first week," she said as she slapped her hands loudly and echoing throughout the small building. "Now, what was I saying? Again, you ask too many questions." "Why repeat it if you don't want me to know then?" She stopped in her tracks and stared ahead of her as she had seen something horrific that had gone undetected by him. He crouched slightly as he slowly paced to her and looked at her face that seemed expressionless again. Turning to him, she scowled and reared back as she were to slap him before he jumped back. "What the hell? I thought you were supposed to be a professional." "I am!" she shouted. "I'm trying to help you, Neanderthal. Do you not see that? I'm tired of seeing them die. Listen!" He stopped as he stood up straight from his crouched position, as if a father had pulled his disgraceful son to stand up correctly. "Stand up and do your job. Stop being a brave little shit. We get nothing from it, and neither do you. We obtain nothing if you die. Do you understand?" "I understand," he whispered. What of the bodies left behind? Can I recover their research? Is that possible?" "Kyron, you are a smart child. Use it wisely. I say what I mean, and I mean what I said. Remember that from your childhood?" "I think so," he said, but felt something in his archives shiver. "Then you understand, but simply do not wish to accept it. You do have the choice to live, but only if your will to live is much greater than your will to end the pain. I'm not the depressed type, Dr. Sharp, and neither were they. Use your head." He stood as she came to the far end of the building at a thick glass peering out, with her legs spread slightly as if a child were gazing at one of the animals in the zoo. Curious and full of amusement, but yet full of wonder and bewilderment at the same time. A teenager that claims to know everything, and yet when they get behind the wheel for the first time, they begin to sweat profusely and finally admit that they're scared. The physical knowledge of seeing an emotion. The stance in which their body lies, in which they can provide lies in that very moment. This older tanned woman stood with such innocence, with her arms hanging limply by her sides, almost as if she were going through her 25th therapist that claimed that they would help her, and she was merely trying to get real with them, but they still did not get it. They still did not understand it. It was in her body and the position she stood, as she peered out the window, he knew was a one-way glass. It was like she knew, but yet the inability to express it. "Kyron." Kyron approached the glass and stood beside her as she stood in the same stance. He stared out the window and tried to focus on anything that she was seeing. He saw moss, an array of it actually. He saw many trees, some that were familiar, but many that were not. They were unknown, just as the palm tree feels foreign to those in the far north, or the Arctic willow feels foreign to those in the south, back in the times of old. He noticed a common skink quickly climbing up what appeared to be an evergreen, but he felt the need to not feel so sure about anything he sees here. There did not seem to be anything else but dead leaves, pine needles, and typical debris found on a florist's floor. So he waited for her to continue when she was ready. She stood there for several minutes silently as she stared at the unknown that he could not seem to find, or perhaps she was not staring at anything at all. Perhaps she was lost in thought and needed time to sort things through before proceeding on. After it seemed like the silence dragged for nearly 10 minutes, he decided to look down at her and speak when she returned sights on him. "You are a young boy. Are you sure you wish to do this? If you are in trouble, no one can save you. Do you understand this?" She asked as she clasped her hands together and allowed them to dangle in front of her. "I understand," he responded. His throat was beginning to feel dry. "Good. Now, let us get over some of the things that you need to know about this facility. Here's a map that should show you how many paces that the next facility is, and then the next. From there, we have not yet been able to reach the fourth, though we have strong evidence to believe that there is a total of 6 until you come out of the Continental Divide. Do not ask because I know you already will. It's classified how we know this much, okay? So tell me if you understand this map, she said as she handed it to him. He took it in hand and opened a fairly small map about the height and width of a standard textbook when fully unfolded. There was a red line just before the middle of the line showed several small symbols. Glancing at the bottom, he saw the category plants and animals marked by color. Plants and animals were differentiated by adding an X to the animals while the plants were solid colored dots. There was a small building symbol that he saw on the map as well. This must have been the facilities. The thin, light blue lines going across the divide unevenly must have been the rivers. There seemed to be several small lakes here and there as well, as most of the rivers led the bodies of water. He noted that 2 rivers seemed to just stop and that he would have to check on those. He then saw several deep red X's on the map that had no colored circles, like the plants and animals. "What are these?" he asked when he did not see the symbol down in the keys. "Those are the last signals we received from the previous lucky contenders," she said apathetically. "I would recommend steering clear of them." "Why is that?" he asked as he looked back at her. "Because it is in your best interest, that's why." She looked him in the eye like a mother would her child when her child should know in what way that they meant. Her hands went back to her hips as she turned back to the glass and stared out again. "You have your GPS, and this will help you guide through the forest while using the map. If you lose the map, just remember to head northwest until you either reach the shore or the end of the forest on the other side of the divide. If you make it there, your GPS should allow you to call us. If not, search for the coordinates 32.235422 and the -41.208180. No, you don't have to remember that number. It is plated on the back of your GPS, and that will show you your current coordinates there. Once you at least reach this point, it will allow you to call us." "Where is that coordinate exactly?" "It's just on the other side of the divide. We have a facility there that will receive your call for pickup. They will lock on your coordinates if you have to get moving after your call for whatever reason, and will locate you from there. And no, you cannot call and then go back into the forest divide. They will not pursue you there. If they see you enter it again, they will abort their pickup and return back to the facility." "Why would I go back into the forest?" "I have no answers for you, but you need to know this." He glanced back down to the map and counted the red X's on it, and then noticed one that was much further than the others. It was perhaps 2/3 of the way through the divide. "What of this one?" he asked as he pointed to it. "What happened to this one? Did they never find the next facility? Shouldn't there have been another one close by?" "We don't know." Her eyes wandered back to the glass again. "What are you looking at anyway?" She shook her head only once as she turned back to him. "I don't know that either." "You okay?" he asked as he furrowed his brow. "That's an inappropriate question. Time runs short. What real questions do you have for me before I depart from here?" she said blandly. They went over the map keys to ensure he understood each of them, along with ensuring that he knew how to use the GPS and the equipment that he would be carrying, such as weapons, tools, and sample containers. One of the items he found most interesting and could not wait to try out was a handheld machine resembling a gun, designed to obtain information and data about a substance. What the substance was made out of, along with a few other things such as estimated age, and would assist in showing what color code the substance was considered. He was given only a few clips of bullets and then several tranquilizers, which varied in strength according to color. It seemed like they knew a lot more about this place than they claimed. Of course they did. She would not tell him much, and everything seemed to be classified. Z bid her farewells and left the facility several hours before dark. Kyron stood at the glass where Z had been gazing out and into the unknown and wondered if she had been looking at something but did not wish to share it with him. After 10 minutes of no activity outside the glass, he got himself up to explore the facility more before his departure in the morning. He decided not to make it too early so he would be able to see clearly out when he ventured into the outside world. He would stay in this facility for several days until moving on.
They said he would have a total of 3 months to work, while they estimate that it should only take about a month on foot to cross it if it were to be non-stop and rest as often as an average person. He wondered what would happen if he did not die, but took longer than the allotted 3 months to leave the Continental Divide. Considering all that he was advised of, they would likely leave him and find a new candidate. Entering the sleeping area of the facility, he saw that it did not appear all that comfortable, but reminded himself that he was not sleeping outside. Sitting himself down on the bed, he took the index booklet in hand and flipped through it quickly, but did not focus on any of them. Excitement had consumed him as he realized something he could try now instead of later, as he scooted himself back into the main part and snagged the sampler gun. Sprinting back into his room, he sat down on the floor and took out his sobriety coin and placed it on the metal floor. He aimed the gun at it and pulled the trigger as a light turned on. Across the tiny screen it says "Release Trigger," and then went to "Analyzing." This only lasted for around 5 seconds before it came back up on the screen with 2 options: Basic and Advanced. He chose Basic first to see what it said. Metal, silver, and aluminum. He switched it over to Advanced as the screen changed. Silver, 13.46%, aluminum, 85.54%. It then proceeded to show a breakdown of both metals, their elemental abbreviations, their groups, their chemical formula, and so on. "Neat," he whispered. As he scrolled down on the little screen, it mentioned that it was created several years ago and also provided that it had fingerprints on it as well as human-based particles. He did not read onto it further, but reset it and glanced around, wondering what he could try out next. He did this with several items until he noticed it was growing dark and decided to lie down in front of the window and watch as the day dimmed into darkness. Kyron was very skeptical about going out on his own for the first day. He had forgotten about the sandy terrain around the facility, where several small animals lay about. He decided to scan one of the skeletons closest to the facility and see if it would identify the animal it used to be. When it reached the analyzing screen, he quickly stepped back into the facility and waited until it finished. He read through, seeing it detected the bone that was made of collagen, along with several other minor materials, as he went into the advanced section, and quickly read through it until reaching the bottom, seeing that it used to be a rugged hair. What he found odd was it detected an unknown degenerative compound. He did this with the other skeletons, most of which were all rugged hairs except for the final one he scanned. This one was the skeleton of an average house cat. He found this very unusual, as he did not think feral cats would be this deep in the woods, but assumed that there must be commonly known wildlife here too. The first several days were becoming more familiar with his surroundings, watching the green-coated animals, and learning about their behaviors. He wrote a lot of his findings down in his leather-bound booklet he bought himself, along with sketching out some in case that they took his book back. He obtained samples of other green-coated plants and also used his scanner to analyze them as well as write his findings down there. After nearly a week of this, he decided he might try to trek out into the wilderness now and explore. During the night of that week, he had been testing out the weapons to ensure that he knew how to use them and quickly. He hoped he would not need to use them, but he knew that he would at some point. On the final morning, he reviewed the map carefully and determined that the next facility he should be able to reach before dusk unless he ran into some issues. He strapped the GPS on his wrist and used it to help him guide along the Continental Divide. With all of his belongings and gear packed, he looked at the facility once more and then closed the door one final time as he departed. As his feet left the sandy circle and onto the forest floor, he reminded himself he ventured out this way last week and quite often, and was not in the unknown just yet. Within 30 minutes of walking, he located several green-coated plants that he had not yet seen, gathered their information as well as a sample, and went on. He noticed that the air here felt denser but was cleaner. The trees here were getting larger each hour he tread until he finally came across one that seemed like it had to be at least 20,000 cubic feet. It was the largest tree that he had ever seen, but thought that he might find some even larger the deeper he goes. He took a sample of the bark that was not one of the items required and continued on. The sun had already reached its peak several hours ago and was going to be setting soon. Glancing at his GPS and then looking at his map, he located the area where he should be and marked it. He was perhaps an hour away from the next facility, he suspected, if his calculations were correct. This meant he had at least 3 hours to spare before dusk hit. Finding a large rock, he sat down on it and pulled out a protein bar to snack on, and drank his bottled water. He was glad they had given him one of those filtered straws. The forest was very quiet, and to him it seemed eerily quiet, uncomfortably quiet even. As he took another bite, he heard something from behind him when he noticed a set of ears poking out from behind the rock. He sat still for several moments and listened carefully, as it seemed to be doing the same to him. His cheeks began growing hot as his heart beat rapidly, wanting to move but not knowing whether he should or not. He could not see what type of creature it was, and he best play it safe and cease moving until he could tell. Some of the creatures here will not attack unless provoked, and he certainly did not want to do that now. The wrapper in his hand crinkled slightly when the creature's head shot up and looked him dead in the eye. Chiron made no sound but could feel a lump form in his throat when 3 sets of solid white eyes stared at him on the solid black head that resembled a wolf's. The creature stood as Chiron went through his head until recalling this frightening beast from the booklet. Its long, slender legs climbed the rock as it dug its thick nails in the ruts, where it hopped up on the rest of the way onto the rock. It stood with its head held high as it looked down on Chiron with its terrifying yet majestic gaze. A light breeze blew as the jet black fur rustled lightly, giving Chiron shivers. "You're a dark watcher," he breathed. Almost as if the creature understood, it seemed as though it gave him a single nod. All 6 of its eyes blinked simultaneously as it continued its gaze, then he felt he would be sucked into if he did not look away. He recalled this as a red-coated creature, but it should not be seen until he was deeper into the woods. It was out of place. Why was it here? More importantly, he asked himself why it was not attacking him. These animals were typically violent creatures and were recommended to be shot on sight. Chiron glanced to his feet and thought of reaching for his gun when he had a rather childish idea that might get him killed. Taking the protein bar, he snapped it in half and slowly extended his arm and held a piece out to the watcher. Its eyes, though pupilless, seemed to glance down only the first 4, while the other 2 on the top remained on him. It then looked back to him with all sets and stared at him as he felt more shivers trying to cause him to gasp, but he held his composure. He held it there several long moments before it took a single step towards him, but it was obvious in its body language that it was weary. It seemed to keep glancing down at the piece in his hand and then would continue staring at him with its top 2 eyes. Chiron took note that the hair on its neck and back was not raised. This must be a good sign, he hoped. It took a few more steps before stopping, but a mere inch from his hand as it extended its neck out and carefully opened its jaws, displaying large fangs inside of purple gums. Chiron had a strong urge to jerk away from the watcher, but restrained himself and tried to steady his shaking hand. The watcher sunk its front teeth into the protein bar and gently pulled away as Chiron released it, watching in pure awe at the creature. Up close, it seemed like this thing had to be larger than the average wolf, standing nearly 4 feet high while on all 4s. Its head was large, as were its paws. Each toe had what appeared to be a harpy eagle claw, reaching a whopping 3.5 inches in length. As it stepped back with a piece of protein bar, he could hear its claw scraping along the rock and clicking when it made contact. He watched his toes as it went and realized how powerful this creature really was. Its fur was not very thick, and you could see the muscles in its legs and ribs flexing as it walked. It turned around and crouched as it took one last look back at Chiron and gave him what appeared to be one last nod before it jumped off the rock and took off through the woods. Dead leaves scattered about as it galloped through the trees until it was out of sight. Chiron sat on the rock and stared at the direction it left in with his mouth open and felt the tips of his fingers tingling. Glancing down, he could see that he was visibly shaken and leaned back against the rock as he let out an audible sigh. "What the hell was that?" he thought. Furrowing his brow, he leaned back up and got into his bag to retrieve the booklet as he flipped through the pages until he located the Dark Watcher in the red section. He gazed over the picture of an artist's sketch, and it did no justice to what it resembled in real life. Its terrifying elegance, like a shadow of a wolf standing in the midst of your presence with a personality. Its eyes were so alive, full of consciousness and understanding. He glanced over to the information section to make sure he did not misinterpret what he thought he had read before. The Dark Watcher, a wolfish-like, meat-eating mammal with 6 solid white eyes, 3 sets on each side of its face, with a slender snout full of fangs. Typically they are solid black, but some of them have been reported to have a small color on their chest, tail, or paws. This specimen is considered extremely dangerous even when unprovoked. Unlike normal wolves, the Dark Watcher is a lone hunter who has been seen hunting during the day and at night, not seeming to have a specific time it desires to prowl. It is thought that their sight is as great as the average owl for nocturnal vision. Their claws are much larger than normal wolves, as well, reaching between 3 to 4 inches in length. In size comparison, they are as large as grizzly bears. There is no verified data on the top speed of the Watcher, but it is believed to reach about the same speed as a hare at 50 miles per hour or 80 kilometers. The Watcher is also known for its incredible ability to climb, though it bears no opposable thumbs. Dark Watchers are known for hunting anything including humans and should be shot immediately if seen. Tranquilization is optional but not required. Shoot on sight. So, I wasn't wrong, he thought as he glanced back up. So, why didn't it attack me? He leaned back to the page, but there was no further information other than height, weight, and other meaningless information for his questions. Should I have shot it? Perhaps they come back if they don't kill the first time. He considered this and thought he had better get a move on before sun decided to set. He did not want to be out here when night falls. If he were to come across it again, he would not run but walk, as one would do for any stray dog you see on the street. If you run, they run. He may try this and see if there is truly a need to kill it or not. Either that or he was asking for a death wish now. After weighing both options, he considered that he would cross that bridge when he came to it. That is, if he ended up on it. Ahead, he was coming up on a swamp area as the smell of stagnant water hit his nose. He curled his lip and shook his head before proceeding. He was thankful he was given combat boots that were not only water-resistant but steel-toed. The ground became soft as he approached, feeling it give slightly with each step until his shoes squelched when he had to pull them out. It was difficult to tell if the water was deep in some parts, and he considered that it would be best to try to stay along the shoreline, even if this took more time. He was not interested to find out what might be in the water. As he walked along the shoreline, he glanced around every so often, looking for eyes that might be on him, and had his gun ready in its holster, but his hand on the butt of it and ready to pull at any time. The feel of the gun in his hand, even though he was not aiming, made him feel like a badass, as he did when he walked the streets. The thought of the high days resurfaced and realized how far he had truly come.
Kyron and Kyle had gone on a run without Jeremiah. The run was to steal several bottles of opioids from the older couple who lived several blocks from them. Kyle kept tabs on who was being prescribed what, and would weigh whether the target was worth it or not. Kyron was coming off of a high, and he was beginning to feel the sickness wanting to set in. If he could pull this one off, he would be able to get his fix before he started to hit withdrawal. Kyle snuck around the building as he crouched behind the single wagon car with the hatchback and peered around to the front of the house. It seemed easy enough, but they knew to not take chances. Sometimes the old knew that they were coming and were armed. This target, Kyle claimed, was unarmed and barely able to walk without a crutch, which meant their reflexes were very slow. Even if they wanted to pull a gun on them and shoot, they couldn't move fast enough to take it from them and blow their tired brains from their heads in a second. Kyron never could pull the trigger. It was Kyle that was able to do the cold-hearted portion of their runs, if those situations were to arise. It only happened twice, but that was still twice too many for Kyron. One of them had it coming, but the other one, They didn't. It was a cancer patient who wanted to go home to die. The nurse who came to care for him was asleep on the couch. The cancer patient had his bag under the bed and contained all of his medications. Kyle snuck in, and as he grabbed the handle of the bag, the man wrapped his hand around Kyle's wrist. Kyle, without a second thought, pulled the gun and shot the man. Kyron and Kyle left outside the bedroom window before the nurse had time to get to him.
Kyron had a hard time coping with the reminder of the patient for several weeks until it was time to make another run. This time, Kyle stood before a little girl in front of her grandmother, who could not even get out of bed. He slapped the girl aside as he took the medications, but the little girl fought back. She jumped on Kyle's back and began punching him in the back of the head when he grabbed her by the hair and slung her down to the floor before putting a bullet between her eyes. Kyron fell to his knees and vomited at the sight, as Kyle had already raised the window and was looking back at Kyron. Kyle shook his head and jumped out, disappearing without his accomplice. Kyron was guilty of her death by association. He was not the one that pulled the trigger, no, but he knew that Kyle was growing into it, and yet he chose to ignore it. The killing came easier each time. He called 911 and remained at the house when the police arrived and took him away. After some gambling with lawyers, he was able to get out of jail, but to go into rehab where he could get clean. He did, though the first 2 weeks were like a living nightmare, especially the first 5 days. He would lie in bed as the ceiling above him spun. Even if he closed his eyes, he could still feel the spinning motion, and nothing seemed to stop it. The sick feeling in the pit of his stomach burned as he burped often, tasting and smelling sulfur. The smell caused him to gag and vomit into the bucket that only had a mere acid in it. But it would splash into the pan and only cause more heaves to come until nothing was left to regurgitate. One of the nurses there helped him greatly through the entire thing. Most of them showed no sign of emotion, no pity, no sympathy or empathy. No compassion existed in a single bone in their bodies. They robotically did their jobs and would leave. He tried to engage in conversation, but they weren't having any of that with an addict. He was trash. He was beneath the earth to them. He meant nothing but another task to earn the dollar and nothing more. They did not care if he got better or not. They did not care for him at all. Even when he began getting better, they did not praise him or give him any type of positive reinforcement. One of those nurses even gave him a look of one of those high school punk girls that would slouch when bothered by a conversation before she sighed audibly. Her eyes gazed into his, dead and uninterested. She opened her mouth and muttered, "Congratulations." He assumed that they were having a bad day, but the bad days never ended. They always acted this way. But the one nurse that actually spoke to him like he was a human being gave him one. She single-handedly kept him from returning to the street like he longed to. Lauren was her name. She was as average as you could possibly think of a person, but her just giving him hope and believing in him got him through the entire process. He would lie in bed, feeling as though death were upon him. He pressed the nurse button, and when she came, she would sit with him and talk. He was sweating profusely one day when he called her in. She had said, "What can I do for you, honey?" His lungs did not like the oxygen he was getting and burned violently. He asked if she would talk to him. Anything at all, just talk to him. And she did. She talked to him. She spoke of her dog, the last shopping trip that she had, how she was excited about her dinner she was planning on cooking, a book she was reading, a series she was watching, and even of her own small garden that simply could not keep alive. "I keep people alive, not plants," she would say. The phrase always made him smirk, no matter how badly he felt. It was not even 4 weeks later that he had read in the news that Lauren had been beaten to death by her husband. He had always wondered why on earth she would wear so much foundation, but now he knew. To cover up what was hiding behind that sad, smiling face. All the time he lay there in that bed, she was hurting as she tried to speak happily of the life she was living, but all she told him were lies. She had no dog, she had no garden, she had no books to read or a series to watch. She lived in a dump with her trashy husband that spent all of her earnings on the drink once all the bills were paid. She had finally done the wrong thing, and her husband decided that this would be her final mistake. He wanted nothing more than to attend her funeral, but could not bring himself to do so. All he could do was leave her flowers every so often and talk to her, thank her for all the kindness and hope that she shared, even when she did not have her own. He thanked her for being around and for as long as she did, to help him live again. He grieved for her and wanted to return to his old ways, but after all she had done, and then she was gone, he could not bear making her efforts mean nothing, and so she kept him clean, even after she was gone. Chiron came to a sudden halt when his autopilot turned off and stood across the pond from what looked like a rotting cabin sinking into the swamp, covered in moss and decay. Those weird half-mushroom scales grew on the wood panels outside the cabin in the midst of the moss, and provided it with some type of color other than dead wood, dark brown, and moss green. The cabin did not appear more than 50 square feet to him and should be easy to investigate. The question was, did he want to investigate this? It was like it was calling to him, and according to the booklet, nothing but flying spiders would be in there, unless the normal spider was spotted. That was not even his main concern, though those things were cat red. He would never get the opportunity to look at this place again if he did not do it now. The chance would pass and never resurface again, he knew. So, what was he to do? Do the sensible thing and pass on? Or should he go into the cabin and risk his life to an unknown that even those biologists did not even know of? Chiron tightened his laces on his boots, tucked his pants a little deeper into them, as he looked down at the water and contemplated how deep it was. It was so difficult to tell the depth of the water due to the lack of sunlight that could filter through the thicket of the treetops. It was incredible how thick and how large that they grew here in the divide, but then recalled that no one comes here. No one to chop down these amazing artifacts that are almost frozen in time. He did have a flashlight, but what was that in the water? It was not the dark water that scared him, but what lurked in it. He knew there was something in there. Even amoeba are deadly, though invisible to the naked eye. A thought then occurred to him as he took his sample gun out and analyzed the water. It made a tiny beep as he hit the basic. There were extremely high levels of uranium, which was not necessarily deadly, but it could cause him some serious kidney issues if he weren't careful. He could use a filtration system they gave him to restore his water reserves. Once his canteen was full, he placed it back in the bag and stared down at the water. Still unsure of stepping in, he grabbed a pebble and tossed it several feet away from him to see how deep it was. The pebble hit the water, but the way it hit was difficult to tell the depth from it. "Shit," he whispered. Glancing around, he found several fallen logs that were just small enough for him to drag into the water. Taking the first log, he shoved it halfway into the water and waited a moment to see if anything may have been provoked, but it appeared not. He took the next several logs and pushed each other one deeper until it hit the bottom. Pressing hard, it felt like it gave, but only slightly. This must have been the lake's bed. It seemed like it was perhaps 5 feet deep, but this was only halfway across the pond. It was likely to be much deeper and closer to the cabin, which seemed to sit right in the dead center of the pond. Perhaps not. He decided to take several steps in and watch the water around him closely in case something decided to swim nearby. The water began creeping up his pant legs, and he stepped around the areas where he could see the most, trying to keep on somewhat level ground. This is too easy, he thought. Something had to be wrong. Nothing was attacking him in the water, and nothing on land or air seemed to be around either. The only sound was the disturbed waters from his walking and nothing more. There were no birds chirping or the sound of insects buzzing, especially the insects. There should be a plethora in the swamp, but he heard none. He was about 3/4 of the way to the cabin now and could smell something on top of the stagnant waters, but could not quite place it. It was not pungent, but it wasn't pleasant either. It seemed familiar in a way. Continuing his trek, he felt the cabin slowly incline as he felt some relief trickle into his nerves. As he approached the cabin, he could feel his excitement growing and began walking more quicker. The door to the cabin was completely gone, and the windows were nothing but square openings on the walls, appearing as though no glass had ever been placed there. Arriving at the doorway, he looked down and saw some thick algae and moss coating the cabin's floor where it was slightly submerged. He best be careful or he'll slide and bust his ass. Placing one foot on the green-covered floorboards, he felt it bow beneath his weight. Shit, that won't hold me. He decided to press down with one foot while holding himself steady on the door to see what might be beneath the floorboards and if he could manage them breaking and still investigate. The board bowed beneath his weight, but it never broke. Well, let's see what happens then, shall we? Holding himself steady, he placed his other foot on the boards and felt the same bowing, but never snapping. As he looked around, it seemed like there may have been 2 rooms in the house, one on either side, while what appeared to be a living room and a kitchen were in the main portion when first stepping in. The floor inside was sloped down where the back of the cabin was sunk further than the front and seemed to be about foot deep max. It seemed like the water had not come in as much as it was sunk. The first thing he noticed was a wooden bench on the far wall that was in the same shape as the cabin, while a small side table sat right beside it with a single drawer that was calling to him. To the left of this were wooden counters with a large basin sitting on top of them, with several closed bottles full of different dark liquids. It looked like there were some tools sitting about, but he was not even close enough to tell what they were. It was times like this that he wished he had a camera to take photos of the place. He was not a photographer, but it would definitely be their paradise. To the right of the cabinets was a rock fireplace that was half filled with logs that had not yet had their chance to kindle, all that supported the same theme of a forgotten memory, lost in time by a lost soul that will never be known in today's world. He was unsure how to tell the age of the cabin, but... Wait! He took out his sample gun and read on one of the logs inside the cabin and hit the basic quickly. He flipped past all where it spoke about wood, moss, and other elements of the forest until he hit the bottom where the estimated date should be as he stared at it with his brows furrowed in a solid stare. There's no way, he thought in awe. 1275? That's impossible that this thing has lasted this long. There's truly no way it would have made it that long. The elements would have destroyed this place hundreds of years ago. Even if it was well taken care of, that can't be right. Maybe it detected a water bear or something. I'll scan a different spot on the same log. He scanned it again, slightly lower than the first one he scanned, and scrolled back down to the area where estimated the date was given, but it provided the exact same date. Perhaps maybe the wood itself is this old from the ancient trees here, but not the age of the cabin. That has to be it. That's all that would make sense. What was I thinking? He put the gun away and carefully stepped along the wall, trying to place his feet where the least amount of algae and moss were. He made his way to the right bedroom first, as it was the closest to the front door. He noticed pictures hanging from the wall, which he found profoundly odd. Unfortunately, he could not see for the years of dust and muck that covered the glass in the frame. He decided to return to them later when he passed back through. As he approached the next room, he went through the door and peered inside, but it seemed as though this room was just as lonely as the last. On the far wall sat molded blankets on the floor and a bound book next to it, but seemed to be slightly better condition. There was not much water in this room and seemed to have only seeped in from the floorboards. He stepped carefully until he noticed a bookshelf on the wall that had fallen with many books astray. Amongst this was what appeared to be a writing desk, quills, and an assortment of tools that he was not familiar with. Moving his eyes back to the book, he opened it carefully and saw the contents inside were faded, but still legible if one really wanted to try and read it. He checked the sun to see what time of day it was before his investigation, but it seemed he had a little more time before he needed to get moving again. Kyron took the book and sat down on a dry part of the flooring in the bedroom and gently picked up the bound book and undid the remainder of the bindings. As he opened the first pages, there were mainly scribbles that he could not really make anything out of. It seemed like a 4-year-old had taken their tiny little fist, wrapped around a pen, and went to town on it. He flipped several more pages as the scribbles turned into more intricate shapes and curves. Moving on, he came across sketches of different woodland creatures he had seen here. He recognized a rugged hare in one, while another was an insect he had recalled from a cat green, but could not remember its name. The following page had very faded writing, and he considered this must have been where he peeked into the poorly bound booklet. He looked over the writing and realized that it was all written in a specific type of cursive that only a few had been able to master. He was not a master by no means, but he could make out enough to get an idea, but not to read it the way it was intended. This must have been on purpose. Has? Been? He whispered but could not make out the rest. He skipped past this part and continued to the next letters he could recognize. No, I am afraid, he said, barely audible. Chill bumps rose across his arms as the hair raised with it uncomfortably while his heart rate increased. He glanced around once before returning to the book, but he could only make out a few other words that did not make much sense to him, and could not put them in context to understand what the writer was trying to get at. But one word stuck out to him that he could not quite shake off. Watching. Not watch or watcher, but watching. Was he or she being watched, and by whom? The book was in poor condition, but decided he would place it in his bag and study it for when he was at the next facility. Turning to the other books, he recognized that most of them were mildewed beyond repair, and if he were to try and open the book, spores would be set free into the air, and with this place being what it was, he was not interested in that. He did, however, find one book that seemed to be intact enough to open. It was a large black book without any writing on the front, back, or even the bridge of it. As he took it carefully in hand, he slowly opened it, and a key fell out of it. Shit. That may have also been a bookmark. Thankfully, the key had been left for so long that there were small indentions on the pages it sat in for so long. He returned to the page, but had no clue as to what any of the writing meant. It was foreign and not a language he felt like he had ever seen before. One word, he assumed it was a word, was circled in faded red. There were 3 lines across it, almost like an E, but it was missing its spine. The spine had been moved to the center of the 3, and a small circle in the center of it, while being encased in what looked like a hexagon. The artist's drawing to the right of this circled symbol was nearly identical to the one he had seen in the book, but which one? He thought about getting his booklet out when he glanced at the window and realized it was time to get moving. He exited the room and grabbed 3 photos hanging from the wall and left the cabin carefully. He tread through the waters of the swamp until he made it back onto the muddy shore. Glancing down at his GPS as he took out the map, he saw he was about an hour's walk from the next facility and decided to double time it without running. Running would attract unwanted attention. Along the way, he passed several cat green plants that he scanned and took careful samples of, placing them in their containers, and then went back on his way. With the allotted time frame, he noticed the metal building amongst the trees and felt a sigh of relief. It was the same as the first one, with a large sandy area around it. And just like the first one, there were skeletons, but much larger ones than before. These were no rugged hares. Their skulls bore feline-like teeth with small sharp ones, followed by 2 large fangs on the top and bottom. He quickly scanned one of the creatures to see what it used to be with a sample gun. The results mentioned something, but he shoved the gun back into his pocket since it had a history section to preview and would look at it later once inside. As he approached the door, he could feel his heart beginning to flutter with excitement. He was more than ready to rest his feet, after being put on them most of the day, and have a bite to eat without any visitors. Before stepping inside, he gazed at the plethora of colors in the sunset in awe and at their beauty.